Alrighty, I think we're gonna get started, and it's all right if a couple folks trickle in while we get started. So hello, my name is Paloma Ponte, and I work for the Office of Equity and Human Rights. So I want to start by thanking all of you for attending what I'm sure is going to be a really engaging and informative event celebrating 10 years of the Transgender Archives. So we are so fortunate to have the world's largest transgender archives housed here at UVic. And I know I'm personally looking forward to hearing from our presenters about the contents and the history of this collection. So as we begin, I want to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So before introducing our presenters, I want to remind folks that this event is being offered as part of the 4th annual 5 Days of Action, a week-long event in which we ask our campus community to take up calls to action to end discrimination, harassment, and sexualized violence. So today's call to action is to reflect, and so we invite you to critically reflect on how our values and beliefs inform narratives that we hold about other people, our relationship with who we deem as other, and the choices we make about exclusion and inclusion, because ongoing reflection requires considering where the stories we tell ourselves come from and reflecting on how we can challenge them. So today's event will be presented by Dr. Erin DeVore, Chair in Transgender Studies and founder and subject matter expert of the Transgender Archives, as well as Michael Radmacher, the Administrative Officer for the Chair in Transgender Studies, and the Discovery Tool Project Manager. So I'll also let you folks know that this event is being live streamed. So just take that into consideration during the Q&A portion of the event. Your audio will be recorded, but we'll not move the camera so that you won't be filmed. And we'll also be coming around with the mic. And we just ask that you don't take it from us just for COVID reasons. But yeah, with that, I'm going to turn things over to Laura Wilson, the Director of Special Collections and the University Archivist. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Again, my name is Lara Wilson. I'm the Director of Special Collections and the University Archivist. Thank you for coming today. I just would like to acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest on this territory, and it's an honor for me to work with this collection with my colleagues to make it available. I bring greetings from University Librarian Jonathan Bankston, who was unable to join us today. And he wishes to convey his greetings and gratitude to you for joining with us to learn more about these significant materials. And again, my thanks to library employees who help make this material available, and the team and the chair in Transgender Studies office, Dr. DeVore, Michael Radmacher, Jay, Eve, for working together to put this event on today. So, thank you.
The dance. Okay, hi everybody, I'm Aaron DeVore, as you've heard. Sorry this microphone does not amplify in the room, so if you have trouble hearing me, please let me know. And with your permission, I'd like to take my mask off. I think we're far enough away from the front row. In particular, you're okay? Okay, good. There, I have a face. Okay, so just a few words about the Chair in Transgender Studies, and then we'll get into the main content about the archive. So, Chair in Transgender Studies, we're in our 6th year now, and Michael and I and several other people in the room are part of the Chair in Transgender Studies. And we'd have two big projects that we work with, and one is to work with the Transgender Archives, which predates the chair in Transgender Studies, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. We put on conferences every couple of years called Moving Trans History Forward, and you're all invited to the next one, which is not until 2023. We had one earlier this year. They're international, they're interdisciplinary, they're transgenerational, and all things trans in addition to that. We have a scholarships and fellowships program, which we're very pleased about, that we give out every year, scholarships to people here at the University of Victoria and fellowships for people to come visit from other places to do work, mostly with the Transgender Archives, but sometimes just on research projects that are more general than that. We do arts and cultural events. Over here on this table, you'll see a catalog from one of the events that we did, which was an art exhibit downtown at the what's the name of the gallery? Legacy. Sorry, the Legacy, thank you. I was going to say Discovery, but I knew that wasn't right. The Legacy Gallery downtown, which is part of the UVic system, and we do a show there just before each of our conferences. But we put on other arts and cultural events, a dance performance, spoken word performance, and if you'll watch our website or sign up for our newsletter, you'll hear about more of those as well. Also want to mention we do lecture programs all year round. Again, sign up for our newsletter, watch our social media, you'll hear more about those, and you're invited to come to any of them. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that coming up very soon on November 30th is Giving Tuesday, and we rely on the public to help support us. So if you or someone you know has the ability to help out, please keep that in mind. Giving Tuesday is coming up. So let's see if the clicker is working. Yes, okay, so Transgender Archives is the subject of today's talk, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we got started, how we got here to being 10 years in, and I hope it's just the beginning of many, many more decades. So, first of all, why do we need archives? And what are archives? Not everybody who shows up here even really understands exactly what archives are and how they work. And I find very short and to the point that people understand pretty quickly is archives are the raw materials that historians use to write history. Right? So how do we know what happened? Archives, it's not the only raw material, but it is certainly part of it. And here's a quote from George Orwell about why do we need archives. He says, the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. And for trans people, very little of the history has been written yet. There are some books that are history, but not very much. So this is something that's still being done. So we're not even being obliterated, our history, or denied. We don't even know what it is. So we have to write it. And so part of our project is to retain those original materials that historians can write history from. And I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute about what they are. The other quote I put up here is, study the past if you would define the future. And what we know about the past of trans people at this point, as I said, is not that much, or trans plus people, the whole range of trans people, is not that much. But what we do know is not all that happy for the most part. And so we want to define a much better future. And we need to know where we've come from in order to do that. So to me, these are two good quotes that help us to focus on why we need archives, why we should have archives. Okay, so how do we get started here? All right, so the basis for this archives are two things that I identify, and one is a lot of hard work networking, many, many years of networking. I personally have been working in the field of transgender studies before we had the word transgender, certainly before we had transgender studies. So my involvement dates from the early 1980s. And so I know a lot of people who have been involved with trans this and trans that and trans the other thing. And then there's a certain amount of serendipity. The serendipity means, it's just some kind of a lucky thing that happened that you weren't expecting. So I have decades of relationships with trans activists and trans researchers, and I am the founder of this archive. So it's not just ego that makes me tell you this. This is how the founding got happening. In addition, I have been, as I say, doing this kind of research and study and engagement for a long time. And I've also been speaking on this topic, one way or another, and as I say, even before we had the word transgender, but speaking about gender diversity. And so there's quite a lot of awareness at UVic, at all levels of UVic, about trans topics. And then the serendipity. So that's part of the networking. That's part of the laying the groundwork. And then the serendipity. So Ricky Swin Institute is in that picture up there. And the Ricky Swin Institute was set up in the 2000s, and it was something that started by someone named Ricky Swin. And it was her effort to put together a research center and a library and an archive. She spent $3.5 million of her own money putting it together. So she was a wealthy industrialist who happened to be trans and wanted to give back to her community. And she lived for a while in Victoria, and we were having lunch in Oak Bay at a little cafe. And I said, Ricky, what happened to the Ricky Swin Institute? I haven't heard anything about it. She said, well, I closed it down. It didn't work out the way I wanted it to work out. I said, what's going to happen to all of the stuff that's in there? And she said, I'm thinking about moving it to Victoria. I said, oh, would you think about moving it to the University of Victoria? And she said, yeah, I'd think about that. And then I came back to the library here, and there was a different archivist, and there was a different librarian than there are today. And I told them what I'd done. I said, I've just solicited this huge collection. I hope that's okay. And fortunately, they both said that's okay, partly because of the groundwork that I'd done in raising awareness about trans topics and trans issues here on campus, and they were sensitive to that. And it took a couple of years to get that collection here, and that was our first collection. Now, at that point, we did not think of it as the Transgender Archives. We had just acquired a collection. And then, not long after the Ricky Swin collection arrived, I was having a conversation. I got an email or a phone call, I can't remember, from someone by the name of Monica Erickson. And Monica Erickson's father, Reed Erickson, was a really important person in the development of trans advocacy and education about trans topics. It was very little known. Hardly anybody knew his story. And then I heard about him, and I was fascinated by his story. He was a trans man, another very wealthy trans individual, and I want to emphasize that there are really, really, really very few very wealthy trans individuals, but the stories I'm telling you bring some of them forward because these were some individuals that used their money for the good of other people. All right? But by and large, the trans population is much poorer than the rest of the population. So I don't want you to get the wrong impression just because I'm all of a sudden talking about trans millionaires. So he had a lot of money, and he used it to set up an Erickson Educational Foundation. I'll tell you more about it in a few minutes. And I was fascinated by his story, and I became his biographer and started to uncover his story and to write about it and bring his name to the attention of the public. And he was already dead by the time I started doing this, but I knew his daughter. And she called me up one day, and she had all of his papers, all of the history of his organization and his work that did exist, and she was ready to donate it somewhere. She said, where should I donate it? And I gave her a list of places. I said the Kinsey Institute, some of you may have heard of Kinsey, and a couple of other places that had big archives. And I said, or you could give it to the University of Victoria. We'd be happy to have it. And she said, well, you've been doing all this work on behalf of my father for years. Why would I give it anywhere else? Sure. So that arrived. And that was also a very large collection. Right now, we've whittled it down to 45 boxes. Laura, do you know how many boxes we have in Ricky Swin? 50 or 60, somewhere in that range. And by boxes, I mean bankers' boxes. Now, the Ricky Swin collection also had a whole bunch of books that went into circulation as well, so that wasn't the whole collection. So then we had two collections that were a pretty big size. But we still didn't think of ourselves yet as the Transgender Archives. Then I'm at a conference in Vancouver at SFU, and I ran into someone named Stephanie Castle. Stephanie Castle is now deceased, but at that point she was, I think, 83, 84, maybe 85 years old, and she was a longtime activist in Vancouver, transsexual woman. And I said, Stephanie, what's going on with your records? You know, I felt it was okay to talk to someone of that age and say, you know, what about your legacy? What are you going to do with all that? She said, I'd be thrilled to give it to you. I'd be thrilled to have it come to the University of Victoria. And that was local history. And so at that point, we started to think, well, maybe we have something here. So the last big collection came in actually after we, so I'm going to go back one, after we decided we had a transgender archives. Right? So at this point, we said, we're going to give it a name. We're going to go out into the world. We put together a website. We printed up business cards and made an announcement. The next big collection that came in was slightly after that, and that was, again, I had a decades-long relationship with a researcher named Richard Eakins, who had his own transgender archive. He spelled it a little differently, and it was in the UK, and he had kept it at his university, which was at the University of Northern Ireland in Coleraine, Northern Ireland. And he retired, and he had never actually given it to the university. He just kept it at the university. And when he retired, the university said, well, if you're not with us anymore, we don't really want to keep this collection unless you want to give it to us. And he didn't want to give it to them. So he took everything, and it was a big collection. He took everything and he put it in a climate-controlled trailer on his property, with sheep around outside in the fields, outside of the collection. And he kept it there for a couple of years, and then he said, well, but too much work. And then he offered it to the Hall Carpenter Archive at LSU, which is...
University College London?
No, it's not University College London. Sorry, I should have all these details in my head. London School of Economics, LSE, London School of Economics. And they have this, I've been to the archives, the Hall Carpenter Archives. It's an LGBTQ, et cetera, archives at the London School of Economics, which is, hugely prestigious institution. And they said to him, well, yeah, we'd be interested in having that. Send us an inventory of what you have, and we'll look through it and we'll decide what we want. And he said, you got to be kidding. He says, I'm retired. I don't have an inventory. I am not going to spend the next 2 years creating an inventory, and then you're going to break up my collection. So he didn't want to give it to them. And he turned to me, who he had known for a long time. He had heard about the announcement that we had started, and he turned to me and he said, do you want it? And I had a few conversations around here, and we decided we'll take it, no questions asked. Fine. And so Laura and I got to work on getting it shipped across the Atlantic. It came into Montreal. It was trucked across the country. Eventually it arrived at the airport, is where we had to clear customs, and came in here. And that almost doubled the size of what we had. So that was a huge collection when that came in. So that's the building at the beginning. And I mentioned the launch, September 25th, 2011. So that's our 10-year mark, was September of this year. And we launched at the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is the biggest professional association, biggest association, I think, of trans people anywhere. Well, not trans people interested in trans, many of whom are trans. And they had a joint conference that year with Southern Comfort. I don't know if any of you know about that, but it's a big trans gathering that takes place in the southern U.S. and has for many decades. And the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, and also just happened to be the launch of the standards of care that is still current and is just about to be replaced. And some of you will know what I'm talking about, and some of you won't, and I don't have time to tell you all those details. But it was a big event for us, but it was also a big world event in terms of people who were interested in trans topics, and that's where we launched. That's the program. It was in Atlanta, Georgia at Emory University, across the street from the famous, now very famous, CDC, Center for Disease Controls in the U.S. So it's all very interesting. Okay, so what's in the Transgender Archives? You'll see up here that we have research records that go back to the 19th century, and the end of the 19th century, and we have here one of the items, which is called Psychopathia Sexualis. I don't know if the cameras can come in on that. Mike, are we allowed to move this one over to the Elmo?
Yeah.
Got to check with the archivist. So Psychopathia Sexualis, no, I don't have it up there, from 1893.
Nice, Michael.
Well done. Okay, and you're welcome afterwards to come up and take a look if you'd like. So that's one of our oldest items. And then we have records of transgender activism, if we can go back to the PowerPoint. Records of transgender activism that start in 1960 and are transgender activism meaning people who self-consciously call themselves trans and were looking to increase their rights and respect in society. There was transgender activism of that variety in Berlin and in Germany in the 20s and 30s. And some of you have heard of Magnus Hirschfeld. He was associated with that. Some of you have seen the Lily Elbe film, The Danish Girl, and she was part of all of that. But when the Nazis came into power, that all closed down. And some of you will have seen photographs of book burnings in the center of Berlin that the Nazis did. And those books, most of those books, like 80% of the books in that pile, came from Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science and Sexual Research. It's translated differently from different people. And then nothing sprang up again as self-consciously we are trans people until the late 1950s, very early 1960s in the U.S. And so our records of trans activism go back to 1960 from the U.S. From 23 countries on 6 continents. If you know your continents, that means every continent except Antarctica. And 15 languages. And so I've got up on the screen the list of the countries that are currently represented and a few examples of some of the items. And not too much of the international stuff down here. Just checking what we have out. Okay, and how big? When you say we are the largest transgender archives in the world, people usually think of something considerably smaller than we actually are. And so when archivists say, how big is your archives, what they're talking about is you take all the boxes, those bankers' boxes, and side them side by side on a shelf, and the books and the other kinds of cases that we use for our items, and you put them on one big shelf. How long is that shelf? So a football field and a half. Okay? That's a lot of stuff. And when you think about most of it is paper, that's a lot of pieces of paper. And I put up here a list of the different kinds of items that you will find. You know, I think you can all read that. I don't have to walk you through that, but there's many different kinds of items. And I've given you on the screen a few examples of some of the different types of items that we have in different languages. And we'll go into, I'll show you some more of that as we go along. Okay, and now I have pretty much covered this when I've given you the introduction. What are the major collections? But I've got a little more detail here in terms of what is in the Ricky Swin collection and a couple of other items that I wanted to bring to your attention. Ricky Swin has a lot of newsletters. Newsletters is one of the big things that we have. That's the old-fashioned version of a zine. Community put together, community-based. So for instance, here is an example of one of them. This is the FTM newsletter, later became the FTM International newsletter, issue number 1, September 1987. So community produced, and for those of you who can see some of the detail of this, you'll see it was done on a typewriter. And they would have had to find somebody who was willing to print this for them because they probably didn't have their own printing press. This is a much later version. It got quite a bit bigger and fancier and more higher production values. This is 1998, so that's more than 10 years later. I'll come back to some of the other examples. Fantasia Fair, I'll tell you a little more detail about that in a few minutes. And that Ari Kane collection, Ari Kane was one of the people who was a founder of Fantasia Fair. International Foundation for Gender Education was a really big, important organization for a number of years in the transgender organizing world. And Virginia Prince was a key individual. In fact, when I said our records of trans activism go to 1960, that's Virginia Prince, who was active in 1960. Reed Erickson, I'll tell you more about him. I told you a little bit already. Barb Finley and Kimberly Nixon lawsuit is a relatively local story of what happened in Vancouver. Come back to that. Zenith Foundation, that was Stephanie Castle. That was the name of her advocacy organization, the elderly woman I told you about a few minutes ago. University of Ulster Transgender Archive. Now you see, this is from Richard Eakins, the one from Northern Ireland. And he said it had the name Transgender Archive, but you can see it spelled a little differently. And then Ayanna Marikel. Some of her items over here, and this is a picture of her on the screen, Two-Spirit woman, and again, we'll come back to her. All right, so I put up here pictures of the people I just mentioned. And I put this up to point out what we have, what we've done well, and what we haven't done well. So who is represented and who is missing? Anybody want to respond to that question? Sorry, folks at home, I can't hear you if you're responding. Did somebody say something?
I said there's a lot of white folks out there.
Yes, absolutely. And who else? How else would you characterize what you see up there? Very few transmasculine types, yes? The other thing that might not be as quickly obvious is generally middle class as well. All right? So, you know, this tells us something about what we can collect and what we have a lot more trouble collecting, or what we can collect more easily and not so easily. So this is Richard Eakins here. He presents he presents masculinely, but he's not a trans man. That's Reed Erickson. He's a trans man. Ayanna Marikel is an indigenous woman. And so this tells us something about the history of trans people, but history in general, and a problem that we have in collecting the records of history in general. Who has the resources, which are partly money, but not entirely money, to create records of what they've done? Who has the motivation and the belief in themselves to think that records of what they've done are something worth collecting or even creating? Who has the resources, if they get that far, to hang on to them? Who has the security in their lives to drag them around from home to home, or maybe they don't even have to change. Maybe they live in the same place for decades. And then who can afford to give them away? Because we don't have a budget to buy. We have a budget for transportation, so it shouldn't cost somebody to give it to us, but we don't have a budget to buy. And so when you go through all of those questions, what you end up with is the records that are most plentiful in terms of being created, the records that are most plentiful in terms of being hung on to long enough to call them a collection, who has the space to hang on to things, and who can give them away. This is what you see. Is you see white, middle-class trans women, and I will tell you that a lot of the trans women are trans women who were part-time trans. So in other words, they continue to spend part of their lives living as men and having the privileges that come with living as white men with some kind of middle-class income. Not everybody, but that's the preponderance of what we have at this point. So there's gaps there that need to be addressed, for sure. And Reed Erickson, the one trans masculine person in here, he's one of the millionaires that I mentioned before. Right, so that's part of the reason he's an exception. So I need to, point out that this is a limitation of our collection, and it's a limitation that everybody is up against, because this is the reality of the world we live in. Who has the money and the resources and the ability and the belief in themselves? I need to emphasize that you have to believe that what you're doing is something worth recording in the first place. It's not just about money. Oh, wrong direction. Okay, so we do have, having said that, we do have some diversity in our collection, and I put up a few examples. And where does this diversity come from is that the people who did collect and did save and did donate to us had some diversity in what they collected. And the organizations and the folks that created these materials had some diversity in what they represented as well. And so again, around on the tables, you'll see a variety of materials. This one here is one of my many favorites. And this comes from Cuba. And I have to put the microphone down for 1 second. I just wanted to show you those lovely lips. I just find that the lovely pink lips wonderful, and it's a photography book, and the photographs inside are really spectacular. So I encourage you to have a look at that. And then I'm going to come back to Ricky Swin in a moment. I also have up on the screen here another book from Cuba, Trans Cuba. It's a photography book, which is very nice. Okay. So the Ricky Swin collections, I did mention a moment ago what's in it. There's Ricky Swin up at the top. I put in some examples of some of the diversity that shows up in her collection, although she herself was very much middle class, if not wealthy, white trans woman. But there are some materials in there. Okay, Fantasia Fair. Ariadne or Ari Kane up at the top there. A number of years ago. Ari is now, I don't know, about 87, I would say, something like that. Fantasia Fair is a week-long trans event that happens every October, and it has been happening every October since 1974. Okay, so someone who's good at math can tell us how many years that is. It's been up for a long time. It's been running, and as far as we know, it is the longest running trans event in this part of the world. All right, now there may be, and I say that because there's Hydra and Kitoi and other indigenous people in other parts of the world, and I'm not really aware of what kind of gatherings they've been having, which could have been going for hundreds of years. But in this part of the world, it's the longest running trans gathering. It's in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Provincetown is well known for its liberal attitudes towards gender and sexuality, and that's why Ari chose to put it there. And we have records from the fair from 1974 to 2001, so the first period of time. They've promised me, subsequent leaders have promised me more records, but I haven't seen them yet. And there's a program from 1980, very period piece in terms of the artwork. International Foundation for Gender Education was founded by Marissa Sherrill Lynn here. She's passed away now. They sponsored large trans conferences or conventions from 1987 to 2010 and published a magazine called Tapestry. There's one example up there. Here's another. It's a glossy magazine that you would find in a magazine rack in a place like London Drugs. Right? And for many people who thought they were the only person like them in the world, this was a real eye-opener. And they would stumble on this next to, Track and Field magazine or something about cars or whatever. And so you may come up here later when we break, and there's a whole selection of them here. So that was a very important publication. It was really central, and this was a very important organization. It was one of the original board members was Betty Ann Lind. You can see her dates up there. She was also involved in Fantasia Fair, and part of our collection is this piece of artwork, which is a lovely portrait of her. So that's the actual original, and then you can see a reproduction of it up on the wall. Virginia Prince is a founder of modern transgender activism. I said her records go 1960 in our collection. There's a nice picture of her when she was a young person. You can see she lived a very long life, 1913 to 2009, and she was always well-dressed. I knew her in the latter part of her life. So she accidentally became the public face of cross-dressing in the U.S. In 1961, she had a pen pal. Pen pal being someone you write old-fashioned letters to. This is 1961, so the letters were, handwritten, maybe a typewriter, on a piece of paper, stick it in an envelope, write an address on the front, seal it, put a stamp on it, and mail it to someone who is expecting to receive it. They probably won't get it for a week, right? And then they would write back to you. And she had a pen pal who she believed to be a cisgender, heterosexual woman, and Virginia was a lifelong, at that point, a lifelong cross-dresser who did it in secret. And in 1961, this was illegal. Right? It was considered insane. It was illegal. You could go to jail for this. And she corresponded with this other person, and it turned out the other person was also a cross-dresser, which she didn't realize. It's the language they used then, or transvestite actually was the language they used then. They called themselves transvestites. And so she was communicating with this person. They were exchanging letters. They wrote some things that were sexually explicit to one another. Again, remember, this is addressed to one person in an envelope that's sealed, signed, and sent off to that one person. The government of the United States was watching the other person, because they were a known transvestite, and that was against the law. Right? And they opened the mail, and they learned who was writing these letters. And they were charged with sending obscene material through the U.S. mail. So that was against the law to write to another consenting adult that you wanted to do something sexual with them. And so she was convicted of sending obscene materials through the mail. Now, Virginia was white, middle class. She had a PhD in pharmacology from the University of California. Her dad was a doctor. She had every resource available to her. So she got a good lawyer, and the lawyer got her off on probation. But probation means that if you break the law again, you go to jail. She was a lifelong cross-dresser. Cross-dressing was against the law. She was going to break the law again, and everybody knew it. So her lawyer, being smart and well-paid, I'm sure, struck a deal for her and said she was allowed to cross-dress for educational purposes. And that was the beginning of her career as a public advocate and educator on behalf of trans people. And she went around and made speeches to all sorts of folks about trans people. And so here we have a plaque that she received from the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality, a public service award for her pioneering contributions to the understanding of gender and transgender issues. And we have other plaques and awards. This is a trophy cup that she has, again, for years of dedication. And she made her career out of being a public speaker. And she was one of the first to be willing to do that. Now, she had every privilege, but she was also taking some big risks. And she went ahead with those risks. She's also widely recognized, not everybody agrees, but widely recognized as being the source of the word transgender. So at the time that we're discussing, there were really only two words for trans people. And one was transvestite, and the other one was transsexual. Transvestite was someone who part-time, between dressing or acting or presenting as one gender or the other, and there were only binary genders then. There were no other choices. And a transsexual is someone who was full-time and did everything they could medically to transition from one binary gender to the other. Virginia was not interested in a complete medical transition. She was happy to take hormones. And she was not a part-timer. She went full-time. She said, there's no word for me. She says, I'm not changing my sex, because she didn't want genital surgery. She says, I'm changing my gender. And so she created the word transgenderist to describe who she was. And eventually, the rest of the community took it over. And, this Tapestry magazine I showed you a moment ago from IFGE, they used to just be called Tapestry, and they changed their name to Transgender Tapestry. And others took up the word and started using it more or less the way we use it today. And Virginia was furious. She says, that's not what it means. They've ruined my word. But that's where that word came from. And in 1960, at the beginning of her career as a public activist, she started a magazine or a journal, a publication called Transvestia, a play on the word transvestite. This was the very first issue. Okay. And it was tiny like this, so that you could slip it in your pocket and make it disappear. because it was against the law, it was shameful, it was considered sick and terrible to be known as a transvestite. And so people wanted to hide the fact that they had something like that. It got bigger. It went through many, many editions at this size, and eventually it got a little bit bigger than that. So we've got a couple issues up here, and there's a whole selection up here. And that ran for 111 issues from 1960 to 1986. We have digitized the whole thing. We've also digitized the entire tapestry. They're both available 100% online. And that was a huge lifeline to people, just a huge lifeline. Okay, Reed Erickson. I'm running out of time, right?
2:45, so about 15 to 20 left.
Okay. So Reed Erickson, you see his dates up there, 1917 to 1992. He started an organization called the Erickson Educational Foundation. He was, again, one of these millionaires. They were the two, Ricky Swin and Reed Erickson, that I'm talking about here. And you won't hear of too many more. I have to emphasize that. Okay, so he started this organization. He funded it entirely by himself out of his own wealth. He was a trans man. He transitioned under the tutelage of Harry Benjamin. For those of you who know who Harry Benjamin is, just briefly, Harry Benjamin wrote the first book on transsexualism, transsexual phenomenon. You can have a look at that as well. And the Erickson Educational Foundation had three main areas that it was active in. And it was active for 20 years. And during those 20 years, it was a huge force, and funded huge, and I'll go into the details a little bit more right now. So one of the areas, the first place he put money was into an organization called One Inc., which was called a homophile organization. That was a language before we talked about gay pride. So homophile meaning lover of the same, and it was an advocacy organization on behalf of homosexual people. That was the language of the time. That organization he funded for like 20 years and gave them a huge amount of money, and it later evolved, and today it exists as the world's largest LGBTQ archives. Okay, we're the largest trans archives, but LGBTQ archives, it's the University of Southern California in Los Angeles is the home of that archives. So he put money into it, and it kept rolling over in different ways and building and growing, and that's part of his legacy there. Transsexualism was his main area of interest. He started the international conferences of researchers that became the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which I mentioned earlier is the largest trans-focused organization in the world. Their conferences now draw 1,000 people. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by largest. WPATH also puts out internationally recognized standards of care for the medical care of trans people who are interested in having medical care. Very influential. And it grew out of the work that he started. And that first conference, by the way, was 1969, just to give you a time context for when he was doing this work. He funded all the earliest researchers in the field of transsexual, transgender research, and again, transgender wasn't a word then. I'm using it looking backwards, but he funded all the early researchers, and when they were just young people getting started themselves, and nobody would fund them. And he had a huge influence in terms of publications, films, TV, radio, and speakers. He touched everything. He put out a newsletter. Oh, and I'll come back, next slide. And then his third area was New Age movements. We take it for granted now that dolphins and whales talk and are intelligent. He funded the first research in that when people thought that was a crackpot idea. Dream research, and I don't know if anybody here has ever heard of Course in Miracles, but it's been translated into like 27 languages and has become a religion. He funded the first edition, the very first publication. So he was a visionary in many ways. Okay, so a little more about publications. He had a newspaper clipping files. We've got one example here. There's 11 books like this. He went at a time, there's no internet, okay? And publications are on paper. And if you don't get it when it comes out, it disappears. Okay. Right? And it was almost impossible to find out what is going on that has anything to do with trans people. The news, there was very little of it, and he had his money. He had money, and he used his money to gather up newspapers from a newspaper clipping service, a service that went and looked at newspapers all across North America, mostly. Any tiny little story or big story that had to do with trans, they're in these clipping files. Like I said, there's 11 books like this that span 10 years or so, where he used that for the basis of newsletters that he put out. Down at the bottom of the screen here are the couple of newsletters, and do we have some out here?
Yeah, they're on the far table there. Color,
You're looking right at, oh, the newsletters, no, those are the pamphlets, yeah.
oh, sorry.
Those are pamphlets, yeah,
don't
but
have
we don't have the newsletters out. Okay.
Yeah.
We have pamphlets. So the pamphlets like this are down at the end here. But the newsletters were these hugely valuable documents that brought together everything that was happening, reports about research, about speakers, about these newspaper items, about news, all manner of valuable information that you could not get anywhere else. You absolutely could not get it anywhere else. It brought it all together in one place at no cost. You just had to ask for it. And to give you a sense of how valuable his publications were, these booklets are nice looking. They're not very long. They're written in accessible language. They're also given out for free. People are still contacting me to donate newsletters and pamphlets. Okay, look at the dates. You're more than 50 years later. People have saved them because they were so important to them. They were such a lifeline to them 50 years ago that they're still holding on to them today, and they cannot bear to throw them away. That's how valuable they were, because you just could not get this information anywhere. Right? There was no internet, and what was in the library was almost nothing, and the kind of information they wanted, you had to have credentials to get your hands on. Right? And even the people with credentials, they were not in every library by a long shot. You know, maybe you had to go to Johns Hopkins, or you had to go to a medical school, and then you had to have credentials. Correspondence funding, application and records, we can find out who he funded and under what circumstances. Court records, there were all sorts of, that's a whole other story. Some of his personal papers, lots of photographs, and ephemera, meaning things that we really didn't expect to last. Things like T-shirts. We've got up here at the front, that would be ephemera. Buttons. Over here, we have a little collection of matchbook covers. That's ephemera. Okay. Matchbook covers from places where there were drag. Okay, getting close to the end. Barb Finley is a lawyer in Vancouver. She spells her name with lower cases like that. And Kimberly Nixon, a trans woman, also in Vancouver. And Kimberly Nixon went to Rape Relief in Vancouver and volunteered to work as a counselor and went to a training session. And they threw her out after the first session, at the end of the first session, saying, because someone asked her, are you trans? She said, yeah. And they said, well, then you can join our men's auxiliary. She went to Human Rights, and the Human Rights Tribunal ruled in her favor and ordered a payment of $7,500, which at the time was the largest payment that the Human Rights Tribunal had ever ordered to be paid to anybody. Rape Relief went to court and appealed that, and the Supreme Court of British Columbia said that no, Rape Relief had the right to discriminate and decide for themselves what they considered to be women only. So there's a provision in the Human Rights Code that says that certain kinds of organizations under certain circumstances don't have to be open to everybody. And they ruled that Rape Relief was within their rights in saying, we get to decide who we consider a woman for our purposes. The BC Court of Appeals upheld that decision because, of course, Barb Finley went back and said, we're going to appeal that decision. And then Barb tried to take it to the Supreme Court of Canada, but they refused to hear the case. They said, you may not like the law, but the law has been followed. You need to change the law. Okay, well, the law has been changed since then. But at that point, that was as far as they got. So Barb Finley donated the records of that case to the Transgender Archive. So if you want to hear all the arguments and know all the details, it's in the Transgender Archives. And then finally, I just wanted to say a few words about the University of Ulster Transgender Archives. I think at the beginning I called it the University of Northern Ireland, but University of Ulster Transgender Archives. And then we'll talk about Ayanna Marical and a few other details, and then I'll stop. So, as I said, this is a big one, 100 linear feet, or 30 meters. 120 years of books. So our Psychopathia Sexualis that I mentioned before was part of that collection. No, actually, we had that one before. They gave us another copy of it. Yeah. The one I showed you, it was in our collection already. They gave us a further copy. Lots of EU history. It goes back more than 30 years. And newspaper clippings. So newspaper clippings files go back to the 1920s. Okay. So what do we have from the 1920s about trans people? What we have are little clippings where the newspaper said, this person, male name, was arrested for being dressed in women's clothing in public. That's all that shows up in the 1920s, those kinds of things. Somebody in the 1920s clipped that out and saved it because they were so alone in the world. They thought they were the only one like them, that even that, which was making fun of the person and calling them a pervert and was completely derogatory, to them that was still worthy of clipping out and saving because it meant they were not the only person in the world like them. And they saved it, and here we are 100 years later, and it's part of our history. So that comes to us through this Transgender Archives. Pamphlets, periodicals, photograph ephemera. It's a very extensive collection. A couple of examples up on the screen. Ayanna Marical. Ayanna was a Two-Spirit woman from the Six Nations in Ontario. And she was a cultural artist. She was a scholar. She was an educator, storyteller. I love this picture of her. I think it really gives you a feeling for what a wonderful person she was. This image up on the screen is a cape from one of her performances, which is actually over here on the table. I'm not going to try and lift it up for you, but you can come over and see it up close. She was active in the 1990s to the 2010s, and she was very much about teaching about a decolonized understanding of gender sexuality that came from First Nations traditions. I invited her to speak at the Moving Trans History Forward 2016 conference. We have a panel of elders that we have at each of our conferences, and I thought she would be wonderful, but she was not well. We did everything we could, including trying to get her in. We didn't have Zoom in 2016, but on something like that, but she wasn't even well enough to do that. And she died just a few weeks later. And she bequeathed her archives to the University of Victoria Transgender Archives, and we're very honored to be able to have this collection. It's quite an extensive collection. It's one of our most popular collections. A lot of people come to look at it. Okay, so to conclude, 10th anniversary. What are we having this year? Well, today's event, item number 1. The FTMI newsletter that I was showing you before started out as FTM and later became FTM International. We have also digitized that, and so that will be online. We'll be announcing that shortly. We've got a series of scrapbooks. I have one over here to show you that are from the 1980s, which give you a feeling for what people picked out of the newspapers and magazines that they felt connected to who they were as trans people. And this is one person who has created, is it 8 scrapbooks? 13. 13? Yeah. 13 scrapbooks, okay? And so it's a whole series. We've just got one out today, but please take a look at those. And they will be going online during this year as well. We've got the Trans Activism Oral History Project. Amelia is putting Amelia, raise your hand. Amelia is putting together a digital display as kind of a welcome portal context for the trans oral histories that I worked on this project with a couple of other colleagues, and we collected elder activists, trans activists, oral histories about some parts of their lives. So that will be going up. The oral histories will be available, and there will be a display to give you context for them. We're just signing, we've signed the papers, and we're just in the process of trying to get the collection here, so I'm not yet at liberty to disclose exactly who it is, but we've got a lovely big collection coming in from a Black trans author, trans man author, so that'll help with some of the gaps. It's just a small touch, but every little bit helps to fix some of the gaps in our collections. We're applying right now for 2 digitization grants. Too early to say if we're going to get them, but we've at least made it past the first round, and there's a second stage, and we're just, have we hit send on that yet? Friday. Okay, so we're just about to hit send on the complete application on 2 different grants. One is a big grant with a number of partners to digitize material from Black, Indigenous, and people of color, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and the other is for a lot of AV materials we have here and newsletters here at the Transgender Archives to get more of those available to the public. And we're resuming our visitors, our research visitors and public lectures, and continuing to build our discovery tool, which Mike will get a minute or 2 to talk about. I just wanted to give you an idea when I say our visitors. This is just a few of more than 50 visitors that we've had in over the last 5 years, where they come from, and some of the kinds of topics that they talk about. And you'll see it's quite varied, both in terms of where they come from and in terms of what they speak about. One of our speakers is here in the front row, one of the people on that list. She's still reading to find her name. Oh, and one of them is in the overflow room. Hi, Esther. Okay. And then we have this discovery tool that we've been working on for several years, which allows people who are not here in person to learn a little bit more about what we have. Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about the discovery tool?
Thank you. So yeah, the discovery tool, I'm the project manager of it. It's, I think, going on 4 to 5 years now. We're able to do it through the MyTax program. We bring in international interns we've had from all across the world. And they usually come in person. Last time we did it online because of the pandemic. And we actually identify a sampling selection of our periodicals, and they read them page by page by page. And we get them to index very important metadata points, meaning people, places, locations, events. So it's more than just it's not just digitizing them, it's actually indexing that material so it can be presented visually to anyone who visits our website. So as you can see, we have 92 publications, 771 issues, more than 5,000 articles, and the really important one is events, nearly 1,000 events. So that's obviously how trans folk in the past really disseminated information and shared stories, was events. So you can actually search over, it's almost over 1,000 now, events. So that's what we're working on, and we're going to continue to work on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And Michael is behind the scenes for really a lot of what you see, and is a huge part of what we do in the Chair in Transgender Studies and what we do in the Transgender Archives. And this is another big part of what Michael does, is our social media. We have a big social media presence. All those speakers I mentioned and the events I mentioned, almost all of that is up on YouTube. And so we have a big library that you can consult to learn from, to be entertained by. So there's YouTube, but there's also all the other social media. And we have a newsletter as well that you can sign up for. And I think there's a page at the door if you haven't already. So that's where I will stop. And thank you for paying attention for this long, and open it up to questions or comments from you. Jay has a microphone and will come to you, and as we mentioned at the beginning, as Paloma mentioned at the beginning, if you do want to ask a question, your voice will be recorded, but your face will not. Jay will be hanging on to the microphone mostly for COVID reasons so that we don't get people passing germs from person to person. So I open it up to you.
How do you receive most of the monetary donations for the chair's budgeting? Is it mostly through donation or is it through the university itself?
You said the monetary donations?
Sorry, how do you get the budget, I guess, for this? Is it
How do we get
mostly
the budget?
donation?
So the University of Victoria, the Transgender Archives are part of the University of Victoria Libraries. And so the library has a budget, and a portion of that budget goes to pay for all of what goes into this. So there's an archival staff headed up by Lara, who is our head of archives and special collections, and they have many collections, not just the Transgender Archives, but we get a portion of their time. I mentioned before that when people make a material donation, there's expenses to bring it here often. Sometimes they donate the cost of that as well. But if they can't afford that, the library has a budget that goes towards that, and if there's any expenses for public events. The chair in transgender studies is the operational cost of chair in transgender studies is covered by private donations. Most of which has come from the Tawani Foundation, but not all of it. My salary, who I occupy the chair, is paid for by the university, but all the staffing and programming expenses, we raise the funds for that. And I didn't put a donate button up here, but there's a donate button on all of our websites and materials, and you can click on that. As I said before, if you know anybody or if you yourself are in a position to donate, there's a very easy put in your credit card number donation option. And we're always welcoming new material content as well. For those who may have material content, please get in touch with us if you have objects or papers or whatever that you think we might be interested in. Get in touch with us at this point because we're quite large. Sometimes we have to say to people we've already got enough of that and we don't take everything that is offered to us. But we're certainly interested in hearing from people who have material they'd like to donate.
I had a question about your archives. I noticed a lot of the material is historical and social in nature. I was just wondering if your research also included more medical-focused emphasis in any regard.
Good question. So there's kind of two ways to answer that question. So the Transgender Archives is material that people bring to us and offer to us. And so if they bring to us material that is medically focused and it's related, yes, we would collect that, but we're not soliciting in particular. So for instance, the first book on transsexualism I mentioned before is this one, The Transsexual Phenomenon by Harry Benjamin. As part of the Ricky Swin collection, and I asked Ricky where did she get it from, and she says she doesn't remember. So this book has photographs in it. And we have, as part of our collection, the original photographs. Maybe, Michael, you could put that up on the Elmo. The original photographs, the original negatives, the model releases that went into the book. And so, to me, this is one of our more special pieces of the collection. And this is not medical in the sense of here's the dose, but it was very much the level of medical knowledge at the time. And you can see it says focus 57%, number 4. So the number 4 tells you where it shows up in the series of photographs in this landmark, groundbreaking book. And 57% says, produce it at 57% size. And then we also have the negatives in the model release form. So to me, this is a huge treasure. As far as I've been able to determine, it's the only set in the world that exists of the original photographs that went into the very first book. All right. The second book was called Transsexualism and Sex Reassignment, and it was an edited collection edited by John Money and Richard Green. And I never knew Harry Benjamin, and we don't know how we got this. Richard Green was somebody I knew for many years. John Money I never really knew, and I never really liked him much. But Richard Green was okay. Okay, I mean, our paths crossed, but I can't say that I ever took to him. Richard Green was a prickly sort of fellow, but we developed a relationship. And towards the end of his life, I mean, I was after him for some time. Towards the end of his life, he died a couple of years ago. He started going through his stuff, and he sent us a box that was everything he had retained of the correspondence in the earlier drafts and what went into putting together the second book. So again, it's not medical in the sense that it's a physician's records, but it is certainly part of the development of the treatment protocols and the medical history of how we got to where we are today. So we do have some of that kind of content, and those are two of my favorites. There's some other stuff. But, you know, again, I said writing, this is stuff we write history from. So, you know, yes, we have these two books, but what went into the making of them is also part of history, and that's part of what we have in our archives. Sorry to be pointing, but that's how Jay knows where to go with the microphone.
Okay. Because the early editions of the Transvestia magazines, the little ones, were illegal to possess, how were they circulated? Were they for sale, or were they, and where would you get them?
Okay, good question. So I don't know that they were illegal to possess. What was illegal was to send them through the mail. And there was a court case about that. And in fact, the court case that I mentioned, many people will say that they were really after the magazine, and they were trying to close Virginia down, but they arrested her for the letters because the letters had something sexually explicit in it. And the newsletter, she was very careful to not put anything sexually explicit into it, so they couldn't actually bust her for that. All right? But it was, there's the little tiny one. And you can see this was donated by Virginia Prince. It wasn't donated to us. It was donated to the International Foundation for Gender Education. Ricky Swin bought it from them for her institute, and then Ricky Swin donated it to us. But it's, again, if you are into all of this stuff, knowing that provenance is actually kind of great, you know, and knowing that this was Virginia's originally is kind of great. So how she had a mailing list that was kind of word of mouth is how people would find out about it from somebody else they would know who was kind of, everybody was underground about it. It was all quite secret. So there'd be a mailing list, and there would be, you know, unmarked brown paper envelopes. You've heard about that probably when, you know, we don't want anybody to know what's coming to us. And some people, it wasn't unusual for decades, not just in 1960. It wasn't unusual, I would say, into the 90s, it wasn't unusual for people to actually take out a post office box so they could get this kind of material sent to them, so it wouldn't come to their house, so that their families wouldn't know, their neighbors wouldn't stumble upon it. Right? So brown paper envelope with no markings on it, and sometimes even to a post office box, with, you know, maybe even under an assumed name, probably under an assumed name. Or, you know, an unnumbered, you know, they talk about numbered Swiss bank accounts. Well, people had, you know, mailboxes like that so they could receive this material, and nobody would know, because the social consequences and the financial consequences until very recently, and still in many places today as well, were very, very dire. Very, very dire. What's the time? What time is it?
It's 12 after.
Okay, so another question or two, and then I'd like to give you some time to actually get out of your seats and come up here, and you are permitted to touch this material, or at least come stand over it closer so you can see it better.
We do have a question from Zoom, from the Zoom audience. Do the general people have access to the archives material?
Okay, good question, thank you. So does the general public have access to archives material? Absolutely. The archives are free and open to the public. What is required is, it's the nature of archives that it's not a library. They're not on a shelf where you can come and browse them. Right? They're kept in storage, and we have on our website what we call finding aids, listings of what is in the archives. Now those listings will tell you things like we have TVTS tapestry, and it goes from this date to this date, and we have this many issues. But the listing in the finding aid will not tell you what's on every page. Now, the discovery tool, we have in fact included tapestry in the discovery tool, so you will be able to find out what's in every article if you use the discovery tool for tapestry. But we have hundreds of newsletters, and they're not all indexed into the discovery tool. And so if you look in our finding aid and you see, there's a newsletter from, I don't know, Des Moines, Iowa, that was published between 1984 and 1986, if you want to see that, you have to come here. And you come here and you come to the desk and you'll be asked for some kind of ID so that if something walks, we know who to walk after. And somebody will go get it for you. And it's pretty quick, 10, 15 minutes. Somebody will go get it and they'll bring it out and they'll put it in front of you. There's a lovely reading room a couple of doors down this way. And you can spend hours poring over these things. But one of the pleasures and excitements about an archive is discovering things that you didn't know were there. So if you go into our listings and you're interested in Reed Erickson and you see that in box 12 there are 37 folders and folder number 16 is correspondence. That's all the finding aid's going to tell you. You have to get into box 12 and go into folder whatever number I just made up and open it up and look at the correspondence to find out who wrote to who and what they were talking about. And I can't tell you that. I haven't looked at every one of those pieces of paper that makes a football field and a half. You'll discover things. These photographs I was telling you about in for the transsexual phenomenon, we had them for years before I realized we had them because I hadn't looked through every single thing that's in the archive, and nobody has. So it's open to the public for free. Anybody can come in. You don't have to be a UVic student, faculty, or staff. And you don't even have to have a UVic library card because nothing's being checked out. Nothing leaves. Okay, so yes, it's open to everybody for free. The hours are Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. All right, so it's not open the same hours as the library as a whole because it requires much more personal attention and personal service. But yes, everybody can come, and I wish you would. Okay, one last question from at home or in the room. If I could have lunch with anybody in the archives, who would it be? Harry Benjamin. What? Who did you? Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right. Well, I want to have lunch with the two of them together. Thank you. Well, they knew each other, right? So that would be no problem. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Reed Erickson and Harry Benjamin together. Yeah, because I've been studying Reed for such a long time. I feel like I've already know him, and then I've already had lunch with him. I've had lunch with his daughter and his wife and his son, but not with him because he was dead by the time I got interested. But Harry Benjamin's a big draw, too. Thank you. Good question. Okay, I'm going to stop now and say thank you all for your attention and your interest and invite you to come and engage with some of the material. Put your hands on history. It's right here for you.